I stood frozen at my grandfather's funeral, watching a man I called father become a stranger in one heartbeat. The slap echoed through the silent church, but it wasn't the sting on my cheek that broke me. It was seeing my family's true colors when they thought no one who mattered was watching. But they were wrong. Someone was watching, someone who would change everything with just 6 words. That's no way to treat a sailor. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of Grandpa Marshall's funeral arrived with the kind of pristine clarity that felt almost cruel. The sky was too blue, the air too crisp, as if the world hadn't received the memo that our family was shattered. I smoothed down my navy dress uniform, the one Grandpa had been so proud to see me wear the day I graduated from the academy. The brass buttons caught the light as I adjusted my cover, remembering how his weathered hands had straightened my collar that day, his eyes brimming with a pride he rarely expressed in words. "He would have wanted you in that uniform, Morgan," my mother whispered as she handed me a cup of coffee. Her eyes were rimmed red, her normally perfect makeup applied with slightly trembling hands. She looked older suddenly, the loss of her father etching new lines into her face overnight. I nodded, taking the cup without really tasting the bitter liquid. I know. That's why I requested the special leave. 3 days was all I could get. 3 days to fly home, bury my grandfather, and return to my destroyer stationed in Norfolk. It wasn't enough time to properly grieve, but the Navy had its demands, and Grandpa of all people would have understood that duty came first. Mom squeezed my shoulder. "He kept that picture of you at graduation right by his bed, you know, until the very end." I swallowed hard, fighting the lump forming in my throat. We'd spoken weekly on video calls during my deployments, but I hadn't been home in almost 2 years. Always too busy, always promising to visit next time. Now there would be no next time. The house filled gradually with relatives I barely recognized. Distant cousins and family friends offering casseroles and platitudes. I nodded mechanically at their condolences, feeling like an imposter in my own family home, too long gone to truly belong anymore. "Lieutenant Commander Morgan Fletcher." A voice boomed from the doorway, breaking my reverie. Standing at attention in her own kitchen. Some things never change. My father stood framed in the doorway, his imposing frame filling the space completely. Richard Fletcher had never served a day in his life, but he carried himself with the authority of someone who expected to be obeyed without question. His suit was impeccable, his silver hair perfectly styled, his face a mask of appropriate grief, to anyone who didn't know better. "Dad," I acknowledged, straightening imperceptibly. Even at 32, even as a decorated officer responsible for sailors and operations worth millions of dollars, his presence still triggered that childhood reflex. Spine straight, chin up, emotions hidden. He surveyed me critically, eyes lingering on my uniform. "I see you managed to break away from your precious Navy for this at least. Your mother was beginning to think you'd forgotten where home was." The barb landed exactly as intended. I heard what he didn't say aloud. That I hadn't been here for Grandpa's final months, that I'd chosen career over family, that I'd failed in my duties as a granddaughter. The guilt I'd been carrying across 3 oceans threatened to overwhelm me. "I got here as soon as I could," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "The Admiral himself authorized my emergency leave." Something hardened in his expression at the mention of rank. My father had always resented my military career, the independence it gave me, the authority I'd earned outside his sphere of influence. The promotion to lieutenant commander last year had only widened the gulf between us. "Well," he said, straightening his already perfect tie, "I suppose we should be grateful the Navy could spare you for your grandfather's funeral. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us." Now back to the story. My younger brother Jamie appeared then, saving me from having to respond. Unlike me, he had followed in our father's footsteps, Ivy League business school, then directly into the family investment firm. At 28, he already had the corner office, the luxury condo, and the fiancé our parents adored. "Morgan," he said, pulling me into an awkward hug that felt rehearsed. "Good to see you. You look official." "Thanks," I managed, acutely aware of how little we had to say to each other anymore. We'd been close as children, partners in crime against our father's strict household rules. Somewhere along the way, perhaps when I chose Annapolis instead of Princeton, those bonds had begun to fray. "Clarissa wanted to be here," he said, referring to his fiancée, "but she had that charity gala she's been planning for months. She sends her condolences." I nodded as if I understood, though I'd only met Clarissa twice, and found her exactly the type of socially ambitious woman my father would approve of for his son. Of course. The ride to the church was silent, our family splintered into our separate griefs. Mom stared out the window, tissue clutched in her hand. Dad drove with mechanical precision, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Jamie tapped away at his phone, still managing business even today. I sat alone with memories of Grandpa, his weathered laugh, the way he taught me to fish when I was 7, how he'd been the only one to truly support my decision to enter the Naval Academy. The church filled quickly. Grandpa Marshall had been beloved in our small coastal town, a retired merchant marine who'd spent decades at sea before settling here to open the marina that became the heart of our community. I recognized faces from childhood summers spent on his boats, learning to tie knots and read weather patterns from a man who navigated by stars before GPS existed. What I didn't expect were the uniforms. As we entered, I noticed them immediately, over a dozen naval officers and sailors, standing respectfully in the back pews. My grandfather had never served in the actual Navy, but his decades of maritime service and later support of naval causes had earned him respect among the maritime community. Seeing them there, a silent tribute to a man who had loved the sea as they did, loosened something tight in my chest. One figure in particular stood apart, a tall man with silver hair and the distinctive shoulder boards of a rear admiral. I recognized him immediately as Admiral James Harrington, commander of the Norfolk Naval Base, and, by extension, several rungs up my chain of command. I had only met him personally twice, but his reputation as a fair but demanding leader preceded him. What was he doing at my grandfather's funeral? I filed the question away as we took our places in the front pew. The casket loomed before us, draped not with flowers but with the merchant marine flag, red and white with a blue eagle, that Grandpa had requested. The service began, the pastor's words washing over me in waves I couldn't quite grasp. When it came time for the eulogy, my father stood. This had been a point of contention the night before. I had wanted to speak about Grandpa, had prepared words that honored the man who had meant everything to me. But Dad had insisted it wasn't appropriate, that as Grandpa's son-in-law and the head of the family, the duty fell to him. "Marshall Sullivan was a simple man," he began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone used to boardroom speeches. "A man of the sea, who found his purpose in hard work and dedication to his family." I sat straighter, feeling a strange unease as my father continued. The portrait he painted was technically accurate, but somehow hollow. Grandpa reduced to his accomplishments, his business success, his role as patriarch. Nothing of his wicked sense of humor, his boundless curiosity, his quiet wisdom. Though he and I didn't always see eye to eye, my father continued, a hint of something cold entering his voice. He built a legacy that supported this family, a foundation upon which we've been able to build something even greater. My hands clenched in my lap. This wasn't about Grandpa at all. It was about my father, his narrative of success, his vision of family that I had never quite fit into. I felt Mom tense beside me, her hand finding mine in silent understanding. And while some chose to follow his footsteps to the sea, Dad continued, his gaze flickering briefly toward me, others honored him by building upon what he started, growing roots in the community he valued. The implication was clear. Jamie had honored Grandpa by staying, while I had somehow betrayed his legacy by leaving. It took every ounce of military discipline not to stand up and contradict him, to tell everyone how Grandpa had pressed his academy acceptance letter into my hands, eyes shining with tears as he said, "Go further than I ever could, Morgan." Half of. "The sea is in your blood. Don't let anyone clip your wings." The rest of the service passed in a blur of hymns and prayers. Afterward, in the church vestibule, I found myself surrounded by Grandpa's old friends, merchant mariners with sun-weathered faces and calloused hands, sharing stories of voyages long past. For the first time that day, I felt something close to comfort. Lieutenant Commander Fletcher? I turned to find Admiral Harrington standing before me, his presence commanding even in this civilian setting. "Admiral, sir." I responded automatically, fighting the urge to stand at attention. "I didn't expect to see you here." He nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Your grandfather and I served on the same merchant vessel during the Gulf War, before I transferred to the Navy proper. He was the finest navigator I ever knew, saved our ship more than once when equipment failed. When I heard of his passing, I wanted to pay my respects." The revelation stunned me. In all our conversations, Grandpa had never mentioned knowing Admiral Harrington. "He spoke of you often," the Admiral continued, "followed your career with great pride. Said you had the best natural instincts for maritime operations he'd seen since himself." A small smile creased his weathered face. Before I could respond, my father appeared at my elbow, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere. "Richard Fletcher." He introduced himself, extending his hand to the Admiral, with the confidence of someone used to being the most important person in any room. "Morgan's father. I appreciate you coming to support my daughter during this difficult time." The Admiral's expression shifted subtly as he shook my father's hand. "Actually, I came to honor Marshal Sullivan. He was a fine mariner and a good friend." Something flashed across my father's face, annoyance perhaps, at not being the center of attention. "Yes, well, Marshal always did prefer the company of his sailing buddies. Sometimes I think he forgot he had family waiting on shore." The barb was delivered with a smile, but I saw the Admiral's eyes narrow slightly. "On the contrary," he said carefully, "in my experience, Marshal spoke of nothing but his family, especially his granddaughter here." My father's smile tightened. "Yes, Morgan followed his footsteps rather than mine. A choice that has complicated family dynamics, especially when duty keeps her from family obligations." "Dad," I said quietly, mortification burning through me at his thinly veiled criticism in front of my superior officer. The Admiral studied my father for a long moment. "The service takes sacrifice, from those who serve and those who wait for them. Your daughter's deployment schedule has been particularly demanding this past year. The security of our nation has rested partly on her shoulders." Rather than back down, my father's expression hardened, and yet others managed to balance service with family commitment. My father served in Vietnam and never missed a Christmas or family funeral. The comparison hung in the air between us, unfair and cutting. I had been deployed in the Persian Gulf during last Christmas, unable to get leave during heightened tensions in the region. The implied criticism that I had chosen to miss Grandpa's final months made my throat tighten painfully. "Different era, different responsibilities," the Admiral said evenly. "Lieutenant Commander Fletcher's role is strategic. Her absence from certain stations would compromise operations that affect thousands." My father waved this away dismissively. "There's always someone indispensable until they're gone, Admiral. Then the world continues turning. Morgan could have requested compassionate leave months ago, when we knew Marshal was declining. She chose not to." The accusation hit like physical blow. I had requested leave 3 times during Grandpa's illness, each denied due to operational necessity. But explaining that now, defending myself, felt impossible with grief pressing down on my chest. "Richard, please," my mother interjected, appearing beside us. "This isn't the time." But my father was on a roll now, the veneer of funeral decorum slipping to reveal the resentment he'd always harbored about my career choice. "I'm merely pointing out that choices have consequences. Morgan chose the Navy over family obligations. Marshal understood duty, but even he wondered in those final weeks why his favorite grandchild couldn't make it home for a final goodbye." The words sliced through me with surgical precision. Had Grandpa really said that? Had he died thinking I'd abandoned him? "That's enough," I said, my voice low but hard-edged in a way that surprised even me. Grandpa understood. We talked every week. He knew I was trying to get leave. My father's eyes flashed. "What would you know about what he thought? You weren't here. You were too busy playing sailor while Jamie and I managed his care, made his medical decisions, handled his affairs." Playing sailor? I repeated incredulously, heat rising to my face. I'm a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. I've spent the last decade serving this country while you've been moving money from one account to another. As soon as the words left my mouth, I regretted them. Not because they weren't true, but because this was neither the time nor the place. My mother gasped softly. Jamie, who had appeared beside her, looked between us with growing alarm. My father's face darkened, and before I could react, his hand flashed out, connecting with my cheek in a slap that echoed through the now silent vestibule. The shock froze me in place. In 32 years, my father had never struck me. The sting spread across my skin as conversations halted and heads turned. I stood rigidly, military training keeping me upright when all I wanted was to disappear. My father seemed equally stunned by his action, his hand still raised, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. "That's no way to treat a sailor." Admiral Harrington's voice cut through the silence like a blade, quiet but carrying absolute authority. He stepped forward, placing himself subtly between my father and me. Especially not one who serves under my command. The church vestibule went completely silent. My father's face drained of color as he suddenly seemed to remember exactly who was witnessing his behavior. The dozen naval officers who had attended the funeral had all turned toward the confrontation, their expressions hardening at the sight of an officer, one of their own, being struck. "This is a family matter," my father managed, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "Not anymore," the Admiral replied evenly. "Not when you've assaulted a naval officer in uniform." He turned slightly toward me. "Lieutenant Commander Fletcher, are you all right?" I struggled to find my voice, mortification and shock warring within me. "Yes, sir," I managed finally, the military response automatic even as my cheek burned. The Admiral's gaze never left my father's face. Marshal Sullivan was a friend and a man I deeply respected. I can tell you with absolute certainty that he spoke of his granddaughter with nothing but pride and understanding. He knew exactly why she couldn't be here, because I personally explained to him the classified nature of her assignment when he called me 3 months ago. My breath caught. "He called you?" The Admiral nodded. "He wanted to understand why your leave requests kept being denied. So I told him as much as I could about a classified operation." "And do you know what he said?" I shook my head mutely. "He said, 'Then she's exactly where she needs to be. Tell her I understand, and I'm proud.'" The Admiral's voice softened. "He understood duty better than most, Lieutenant Commander. Better than some people ever will." Tears pricked at my eyes. The first I'd allowed myself all day. Grandpa had understood. He hadn't been wondering where I was, hadn't been disappointed in me. The weight that had been crushing me since I'd received news of his death eased slightly. My father seemed to shrink before my eyes, his authority suddenly hollow in the face of the Admiral's quiet strength. The watching naval personnel had formed a loose semicircle around us, their presence a silent wall of support. "Mr. Fletcher," the Admiral continued, his tone deceptively conversational, "I make it a point to know my officers, their strengths, their challenges, their family situations. Do you know what your daughter was doing when she received news of her grandfather's passing?" My father remained silent, a muscle working in his jaw. "She was coordinating a rescue operation in international waters, a container ship with 38 civilians aboard, caught in a storm that had already claimed 2 vessels. She stayed at her post for another 12 hours, ensuring those civilians were safely evacuated, before she permitted herself to process her grief." I stared at the Admiral, shocked that he knew this detail, and that he would share it. The rescue operation had been routine in many ways, but the timing had been devastating, the news of Grandpa's death arriving just as the distress call came in. "Now," the Admiral said, his voice taking on an edge that made even me want to stand straighter, "I believe we're here to honor Marshal Sullivan. I suggest we return our focus to that purpose, rather than diminishing his memory with behavior he would have found deeply disappointing." My father's face went pale as marble. The Admiral's words hung in the air like smoke after artillery fire. I stood frozen between them, my cheeks still stinging, watching as every pair of eyes in that church vestibule turned toward us. The disgraced father, the wronged daughter, and the Admiral, whose presence had just altered the equation entirely. For a terrible moment, I thought my father might attempt to reassert his authority, to challenge the Admiral, to dismiss the intervention as interference in a private family matter. Instead, something seemed to collapse inside him. His shoulders sagged imperceptibly, the rigid pride that had defined him my entire life, suddenly brittle as autumn leaves. "I apologize for the outburst," he said finally, the words clearly costing him. "Today has been difficult for all of us." The Admiral nodded once, accepting the apology without acknowledging its inadequacy. "Grief affects us all differently," he replied, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp and assessing. My mother stepped forward then, her social instincts kicking in to smooth over the impossible scene. "Perhaps we should move to the cemetery," she suggested, her voice higher than normal. "The procession will be starting soon." The gathered officers began to disperse, though I noticed how they moved, not away, but around, forming a loose perimeter that somehow kept my father at a distance from me. It wasn't coordinated or obvious. It was the instinctive response of sailors protecting one of their own. Before we could move toward the waiting cars, the Admiral touched my elbow lightly. "Lieutenant Commander, a word?" I followed him to a quiet corner of the vestibule, still struggling to process what had just happened. My military composure felt threadbare, emotions seeping through the cracks like water through a damaged hull. "Your grandfather was a fine man," the Admiral said quietly. "One of the best I've known." "Thank you, sir," I managed. "I didn't realize you knew him so well." "There's more to it than what I mentioned," he continued, his voice low. "Marshall saved my life during a storm in '91. We were transporting supplies, classified mission. Navigation systems went down, vessel taking on water. Your grandfather guided us through by dead reckoning and stars alone." He paused. "After that, some bonds can't be broken." I nodded, suddenly understanding the Admiral's presence at what should have been a modest funeral for a retired merchant mariner. This wasn't just professional courtesy. This was a debt of honor. "He asked me to look out for you," the Admiral added, surprising me again. "Last time we spoke, said you were doing well, but that your path hadn't been easy." The thought of Grandpa and the Admiral discussing me made my throat tighten. Had Grandpa been worried about me? Had he somehow foreseen this moment? "Sir, You don't need to explain anything," he interrupted gently. "Families are complicated. But I want you to know that Marshall understood exactly who you are and what you've accomplished. Whatever happens after today, remember that." I blinked back tears that threatened to undermine my carefully maintained composure. "Yes, sir." He straightened, his demeanor shifting back to the professional Admiral I knew. "Now I believe we have a good man to lay to rest." The procession to the cemetery was mercifully short. I rode with my mother and brother, my father choosing to drive separately. Whether out of anger or shame, I couldn't tell. Jamie kept shooting me uncertain glances, as if seeing me for the first time. "You okay?" he asked finally, his voice low enough that Mom, staring fixedly out the window, wouldn't hear. I touched my cheek absently. The sting had faded to a dull warmth. "I'll be fine." He hesitated. "I've never seen Dad lose control like that." "Haven't you?" I asked. Memories surfacing of slammed doors, cold silences, the subtle coercions that had characterized our childhood. Dad had never needed to raise a hand before. His disappointment had been weapon enough. Jamie looked away. "Not physically," he conceded. "But Morgan, that Admiral, do you work directly with him?" I could hear the concern in his voice, worry that our father's actions might have professional repercussions for me. It was strangely touching, this flicker of the protective brother I'd once known. "Not directly," I said. "He oversees the entire Norfolk Naval Base. I report through a chain of command. But yes, he could affect my career if he wanted to." "Will he?" I thought about the Admiral's words, the way he'd positioned himself between me and Dad, the quiet authority in his voice. No, I said finally. I think if anything, he's in my corner. Jamie nodded, seeming relieved. Good. That's good. He paused. You know Dad didn't mean it, right? About Grandpa wondering where you were. He was actually really proud of you. Kept that ship model you sent him from Bahrain right by his bed. The model. A small replica of my first destroyer that I'd found in a market during port call. I'd almost forgotten sending it. A poor substitute for my presence during his illness. He talked about you all the time, Jamie continued. Told his hospice nurse his granddaughter was, protecting American interests in the Persian Gulf whenever she asked about family. A small smile found its way to my lips despite everything. That sounded like Grandpa. Proud, a little boastful, with that hint of mischief that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. Thanks, I said simply, reaching over to squeeze Jamie's hand briefly. It was the first genuine moment between us in years. The cemetery was situated on a gentle hill overlooking the bay. It seemed right somehow that Grandpa would rest here, within sight of the water he'd loved his entire life. The naval officers had arrived ahead of us, forming an honor guard along the path to the graveside. As I stepped from the car, I noticed they'd been joined by others, weathered men in merchant marine caps, fishermen in their Sunday best, dock workers and sailors who had known my grandfather during his decades at the marina. He touched a lot of lives, my mother said softly beside me, seeing where my gaze had landed. Yes, I agreed. He did. The graveside service was brief, as Grandpa would have wanted. The pastor spoke of a life well lived, of legacy and faith and the peace that passes understanding. My father stood opposite me, across the open grave, his expression unreadable, his eyes never quite meeting mine. When the pastor invited family members to place flowers on the casket, I moved forward with the single white rose I'd been clutching. As I laid it atop the polished wood, I whispered, "Fair winds and following seas, Grandpa." The old maritime blessing seemed more fitting than any formal prayer. My hand lingered on the smooth surface of the casket. In that moment, the grief I'd been holding at bay threatened to overwhelm me, not just for Grandpa, but for the family that should have supported each other through this loss, and instead had fractured even further. I felt a presence beside me and looked up to see Admiral Harrington. Without ceremony, he placed something small and metallic beside my rose, a naval officer's insignia pin, gleaming gold against the dark wood. He earned this in ways that don't show up in official records, the Admiral said quietly. But those of us who know. I stared at the pin, understanding dimming through my confusion. Grandpa had never officially served in the Navy. He'd been merchant marine his entire career. And yet here was an admiral, honoring him with a symbol typically reserved for commissioned officers. Before I could ask, a sharp voice cut through the moment. What exactly is that supposed to mean? My father had approached without my noticing, his face tight with barely controlled anger. Marshall wasn't Navy. He made that perfectly clear his entire life, said he preferred the freedom of merchant service. The Admiral straightened, regarding my father with cool assessment. Mr. Fletcher, there are aspects of your father-in-law's service that were classified for many years. Some still are. Classified? My father's laugh was brittle. He was a cargo ship captain, not James Bond. During certain conflicts, the Admiral replied evenly. Merchant mariners were recruited for missions that couldn't utilize official naval vessels. Your father-in-law was one such captain. The details remain sensitive, but his service to this country went far beyond what his official record shows. I stood transfixed, pieces clicking into place. Grandpa's occasional cryptic references to special cargo runs. The visits over the years for men he introduced simply as old shipmates. The maps in his study with certain routes marked in red ink that he'd never explained. Why wasn't I told about this? My father demanded, his voice rising. I handled all his affairs. I managed his estate. If there were military benefits or recognitions due, he didn't want recognition. The Admiral interrupted. Men like Marshall did what they did out of duty, not for medals or public acknowledgement. My father's face flushed. So instead of telling his family the truth, he took these secrets to his grave? Left us believing he was just a simple merchant captain? Dad, I said quietly, embarrassment heating my face at his behavior here, at Grandpa's graveside. This isn't the time. When is the time, Morgan? He snapped. After everyone's gone? After we've buried him without knowing who he really was? He turned back to the Admiral. Was any of it real? The marina, the fishing charters? Or was that all some kind of cover, too? The Admiral's expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not anger, but something closer to pity. Mr. Fletcher, your father-in-law was exactly who you thought he was. A skilled mariner who loved his family and served his community. That he also served his country in ways that required discretion doesn't diminish the man you knew. It only adds dimensions you weren't privy to. My father opened his mouth to argue further, but my mother stepped forward, placing a restraining hand on his arm. "Richard, please," she murmured. "Not here." For a moment I thought he might shake her off. Then, with visible effort, he mastered himself. "This conversation isn't over, Admiral," he said stiffly. "I'll be making inquiries through appropriate channels." The Admiral nodded once, unperturbed. "You're welcome to try. But most of those records won't be declassified for another decade." My father stalked away, back rigid with affronted dignity. My mother hesitated, torn between following him and staying with me. "Go," I told her gently. "I'll be fine." After she left, I turned back to the Admiral. "Sir, I don't understand. What exactly did my grandfather do?" The Admiral studied me for a long moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. "Your security clearance covers some of it," he said finally. "Your grandfather ran missions during multiple conflicts: Vietnam, Lebanon, Gulf War, specialized cargo, intelligence operations, extraction of assets from hostile territory. The Merchant Marine provided perfect cover, commercial vessels where naval ships would have raised red flags." I stared at him, trying to reconcile this information with the grandfather I'd known. The man who taught me to fish, who kept candy in his pockets for neighborhood kids, who played checkers with ruthless glee and always let me win at cards. "He never said a word," I murmured. "Not even when I joined the academy." "He wouldn't have," the Admiral replied. "Men of his generation took their oaths seriously. But I suspect your choice of career pleased him more than you know." A memory surfaced Grandpa's face when I'd told him about my acceptance to Annapolis. I'd expected pride, of course, but what I'd seen went deeper. A fierce joy mixed with something that might have been recognition. "So all those stories about merchant shipping," I began, "were true," the Admiral finished. "Just not the complete truth. Marshal Sullivan delivered cargo to every major port in the world. Sometimes that cargo was grain or machinery. Sometimes it was people who needed to disappear, or information that could turn the tide of conflicts." I thought of the maps in Grandpa's study, the red routes that never quite made logical sense for commercial shipping. They made perfect sense now. "Did my grandmother know?" I asked, thinking of the quiet, elegant woman who'd passed away 5 years earlier, who'd rolled her eyes affectionately at Grandpa's seafaring tales. The Admiral nodded. Eleanor was his anchor in every sense. She knew enough, not details, but the nature of his work. Her silence was as much service to this country as his actions. The revelation settled over me like a weighted blanket, heavy but somehow comforting. My grandfather had lived a double life of sorts, but it hadn't been false. Just compartmentalized, with depths I hadn't been allowed to see. "Sir," I said carefully, "why are you telling me this now?" The Admiral's gaze moved past me to where my father stood with my mother near the cemetery gates, his posture broadcasting his displeasure even at a distance. "Marshal asked me to," he said simply. "Not immediately, but when the time was right. He wanted you to know who he really was, to understand that service sometimes requires sacrifice and silence." He paused. I believe today qualified as the right time. I nodded slowly, understanding what he wasn't saying explicitly. The Admiral's intervention after my father's slap hadn't been spontaneous. It had been the action of a man fulfilling a promise to watch over someone important to a friend. "Thank you," I said, feeling the inadequacy of the words. The Admiral inclined his head slightly. "There's more," he added, reaching into his pocket. "Marshal left something in my keeping. For you, when the time came." He pressed a small velvet pouch into my palm. It felt weighty, solid. "Not here," he advised when I moved to open it. Later, when you're alone. Before I could respond, he straightened and saluted the casket with formal precision. Then, with a final nod to me, he turned and walked away, his ramrod posture marking him instantly as military even in his civilian suit. The mourners began dispersing gradually. I remained by the casket, the velvet pouch burning a hole in my palm, my mind racing with questions that had no immediate answers. Jamie approached cautiously, as if afraid I might break. "Everything okay?" he asked, eyeing the retreating form of the Admiral. I tucked the pouch into my uniform pocket. "Just paying respects," I said, not ready to share what I'd learned. Not yet, maybe not ever. Some secrets weren't mine alone to tell. Jamie shifted uncomfortably. "Dad wants us back at the house. There are people coming for the reception." Of course there were. My father would never miss an opportunity for a social gathering, even, perhaps especially, one disguised as mourning. The thought of spending hours in that house, making small talk with distant relatives and pretending the scene at the church hadn't happened, made my stomach clench. "I'll be along shortly," I told him. "I want a few minutes alone with Grandpa." Jamie nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Take your time. I'll run interference with Dad." After he left, I stood in silence, watching the cemetery workers waiting discreetly in the distance for the family to depart so they could complete their solemn task. The velvet pouch seemed to grow heavier in my pocket with each passing moment. Finally, I placed my hand on the casket one last time. "I wish you'd told me," I whispered, "but I understand why you couldn't." Walking back to my rental car, I felt oddly lighter despite the weight of new knowledge. The gulf between who I'd thought Grandpa was and who he'd actually been wasn't as wide as it first appeared. The essence of him, his integrity, his quiet strength, his devotion to family, remained unchanged. He'd simply carried more than I'd known, borne responsibilities I was only now beginning to understand. As I slid into the driver's seat, I finally removed the velvet pouch from my pocket. With fingers that trembled slightly, I loosened the drawstring and tipped the contents into my palm. A ring gleamed against my skin, heavy gold with a dark blue stone, worn smooth by decades of wear. I recognized it instantly as the one Grandpa had always worn on his right hand, the one he'd claimed was just a trinket from his travels. Examining it more closely now, I could make out an insignia embedded in the stone, not navy, but something similar, stylized waves surrounding what might have been a compass or a star. Beneath the ring lay a folded slip of paper. I opened it carefully, recognizing Grandpa's distinctive handwriting immediately. "Morgan, if you're reading this, then James kept his promise. This ring, marked men like me, shadows behind official forces. Wear it if you choose, but keep its meaning to yourself. The work continues through hands like yours. I recognized the call in you before you did. I'm proud beyond words. Remember, true courage isn't in fighting battles everyone can see. It's in the ones no one knows you're fighting. All my love, Grandpa." I closed my fingers around the ring, feeling its solid weight, the smoothness of years of wear. Tears I'd held back all day finally spilled over, not just for grief, but for recognition, of legacy, of connection, of understanding that had come too late for conversation, but perhaps just in time for guidance. The reception at my parents' house loomed ahead, a social minefield I would need to navigate carefully. But for the first time since arriving home, I felt anchored by something stronger than obligation or military discipline. My grandfather had entrusted me with his true self, had seen in me something worth that trust. I slipped the ring onto my right hand, too large for my fingers, but I would have it sized later. For now, its presence was enough, a tangible reminder of the man I'd loved and the legacy he'd left me. Whatever came next with my father, with my fractured family, I would face it knowing I carried more than just Grandpa's DNA. I carried his mission, his values, his quiet strength. I started the car and headed toward my parents' house, the ring a comforting weight on my hand, the Admiral's revelations settling into place in my understanding. The family waiting for me might not comprehend who I truly was, might never fully accept the path I'd chosen, but I knew now that I wasn't alone in that choice. Grandpa had walked a similar road decades before, balancing duty and family, service and silence. The knowledge didn't erase the pain of my father's rejection or the sting of his hand against my cheek. But it placed those hurts in a broader context, one where doing the right thing didn't always mean being understood, where courage sometimes meant standing alone, even among family. I touched the ring once more, a silent promise to the man we had laid to rest. Then I drove toward the reckoning that awaited, stronger than I had been just hours before. I pulled into my parents' driveway, Grandpa's ring heavy on my finger. The house looked exactly as it always had. Colonial style, perfectly maintained, with manicured hedges and seasonal flowers in geometric precision. But something had shifted since I'd left for the funeral this morning. Not in the house, but in me. Cars lined the street, the expected parade of luxury sedans and SUVs that marked my parents' social circle. I sat for a moment, gathering strength, slipping Grandpa's ring off my finger and back into the velvet pouch. Some things weren't meant for public display, not yet. I tucked it safely into my uniform pocket, close to my heart. As I approached the front door, I caught a glimpse of myself in the reflection of the bay window. Lieutenant Commander Morgan Fletcher in full-dress uniform, my grandfather's granddaughter, now carrying not just his DNA but his secret legacy. The woman staring back at me looked different somehow, steadier, more certain, despite the day's emotional upheaval. The murmur of voices grew as I entered, the foyer already filled with black-clad mourners balancing small plates of hors d'oeuvre and crystal tumblers of amber liquor. My mother had engaged her usual army of caterers. Grandpa would have hated the fuss, preferred a simple gathering at his marina with cold beer and fishing stories. But this wasn't about what he would have wanted. It never had been. "Morgan, there you are." My mother materialized beside me, her social smile firmly in place though her eyes remained tense. "People have been asking for you." "Have they?" I asked, genuinely surprised. Most of these people barely knew me, and certainly didn't care about my delayed arrival at a funeral reception. She lowered her voice. "Your father is in his study. He'd like to speak with you privately before you join the gathering." Of course he would. The public confrontation at the church would need to be addressed, contained, reframed, into something that fit the Fletcher family narrative. I nodded, unsurprised. "I'll go to him now." "Morgan," she added, catching my arm as I turned to go, "please remember this is a difficult day for everyone." The plea in her eyes was clear. Don't make this worse, don't challenge him, don't disrupt the carefully constructed peace. I covered her hand with mine briefly. "I know, Mom." The study door was closed when I reached it. I paused, hand raised to knock, memories washing over me, standing in this exact spot as a child, a teenager, a college student, always with some mixture of trepidation and determination. How many times had I been summoned to explain disappointing grades, inappropriate friendships, or worst of all, my decision to attend the Naval Academy instead of following the path he'd laid out. I knocked firmly. "Enter." His voice carried the same authoritative tone it always had, showing no evidence of the public humiliation he'd experienced hours earlier. The study was unchanged. Leather-bound books lining mahogany shelves, the massive desk dominating the space, family photographs arranged with careful precision. My father stood by the window, tumbler of scotch in hand, staring out at the gathering dusk. "Close the door," he said without turning. I did so, then stood at parade rest, an unconscious military stance that had become second nature over the years. The posture gave me comfort now, a physical reminder of who I was beyond this house, beyond his influence. "That was quite a scene you created at the church," he said finally, turning to face me. "I created?" The words escaped before I could stop them, incredulous. His eyes narrowed. "You deliberately provoked me in front of your superior officer." I held his gaze, refusing to look away as I once would have. "You struck me, Dad. In uniform. At Grandpa's funeral. In front of not just the Admiral, but a dozen other naval officers." A momentary lapse. He dismissed with a wave of his hand. "Grief affects us in unexpected ways. I've already spoken with several of our guests who witnessed the incident. They understand completely. Of course he had. My father had spent decades cultivating a network of people who would accept his version of events without question. The thought would once have filled me with bitter resignation. Now it just seemed sad. "Is that why you wanted to see me?" I asked. "To ensure I understand how to discuss what happened?" He took a measured sip of scotch. "Partly, but there's something else we need to address." He moved to the desk, setting down his glass and picking up a folder. "This Admiral Harrington. His claims about your grandfather's service. The shift in topic surprised me. What about them?" "They're clearly exaggerated," he said dismissively. "James Harrington is obviously a man with an agenda. Whatever professional relationship he had with Marshall, this cloak and dagger narrative is absurd." I felt a flare of anger, quickly suppressed. Why would he lie? "I didn't say he was lying," my father corrected, his tone sliding into the condescending one he used when explaining business concepts to those he deemed less intelligent. "I said he was exaggerating. Military men love their stories, their secrets and codes. Merchant marine supply runs become classified missions. Routine cargo deliveries become intelligence operations. It gives them a sense of importance." I thought of the ring in my pocket, of the Admiral's steady gaze as he placed his insignia pin on Grandpa's casket, of the weathered sailors who had stood in silent tribute. None of it suggested fabrication or exaggeration. "Have you considered," I said carefully, "that Grandpa might have had aspects of his life that he chose not to share with you?" My father's expression hardened. "I managed his affairs for 20 years. I had power of attorney. I executed his estate. There is nothing about Marshall Sullivan I don't know." The certainty in his voice was absolute and absolutely wrong. I thought again of the red routes on Grandpa's maps, the mysterious phone calls that would send him into his study for hours, the friends who appeared occasionally with no introduction beyond a firm handshake and knowing eyes. "Dad," I said gently, "people are complex, especially people who serve in certain capacities." "Don't patronize me, Morgan." His voice took on the dangerous quiet I remembered from childhood confrontations. "Whatever game this Admiral is playing, I won't have Marshall's memory twisted into some spy fantasy. He was a hard-working, straightforward businessman who built something real and tangible. Not some shadowy operative." I realized then that my father's anger wasn't just about controlling the narrative. It was about preserving his understanding of who Grandpa had been. The idea that there had been depths to Marshall Sullivan that Richard Fletcher had never accessed, never controlled, never even suspected, was intolerable to him. "I'm not arguing with you," I said, choosing my words with care. "I'm just suggesting there might be more to consider." He stared at me for a long moment, then drained his scotch in one swift motion. "This conversation is pointless. We have guests waiting. I expect you to be civil and appropriate. Whatever delusions this Admiral has planted in your mind can wait." "Yes, sir," I replied, the military acknowledgement slipping out reflexively. His expression flickered at the response. Not the dad or father he expected, but the formal address of a subordinate to an authority figure. It created distance between us, and we both felt it. "Your mother has arranged for you to stay in your old room tonight," he said, changing subjects abruptly. "Your flight isn't until tomorrow afternoon. I hadn't planned on staying." The thought of spending the night in this house, surrounded by memories and expectations and the crushing weight of my father's disappointment, made my chest tighten. But I nodded non-committally. That battle could wait. "Now," he continued, straightening his already impeccable tie, "let's rejoin the guests. People will be wondering where we are." As we moved toward the door, he paused, hand on the knob. "Morgan," he said, not looking at me, "I shouldn't have struck you. It won't happen again." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was more acknowledgement than I'd expected. "Thank you," I said simply. The reception passed in a blur of handshakes and condolences, platitudes about Grandpa's life well lived, and carefully skirted references to the unfortunate tension at the church. I moved through the rooms like an automaton, accepting expressions of sympathy, deflecting questions about my naval service, avoiding my father's watchful gaze. Jamie found me in a quiet corner of the sunroom, momentarily escaped from the press of mourners. "Holding up okay?" he asked, handing me a glass of water. I took it gratefully. "Just tired. It's been a long day." He nodded, leaning against the wall beside me. "Did Dad give you the whole, momentary lapse, speech?" I glanced at him, surprised by the perceptiveness of the question. "How did you know?" Jamie's smile was wry. It's his go-to when he loses control, a momentary lapse in an otherwise exemplary record. He used it on me when he threw that crystal paperweight across the room during our disagreement about the Murray acquisition. This was new information. Jamie, the perfect son who had followed the perfect path into the family business, had faced my father's wrath too? "When was this?" I asked. "Last year. I wanted to take the company in a different direction." He disagreed. Jamie shrugged, but I could see tension in the movement. Nothing hit me, but it was close. The next day, everything was business as usual. The momentary lapse never referenced again. I studied my brother's face, seeing for the first time the faint lines of strain around his eyes, the carefully maintained composure that mirrored my own military mask. We'd been responding to the same pressure in different ways, me by escaping into the Navy, him by conforming so perfectly that the cage became invisible. "Jamie?" I began, not sure what I wanted to say, only that something important was happening between us. "Morgan, there you are." Sarah's voice interrupted us, my brother's fiancée appearing in the doorway. "Your mother's looking for you." "Something about Grandpa Marshall's friends wanting to pay their respects?" I nodded, the moment broken. "I'll be right there." Jamie squeezed my arm briefly. "We'll talk more later," he promised. The friends turned out to be a small group of men I recognized from the funeral, former merchant mariners who had served with Grandpa over the decades. They stood slightly apart from the main gathering, looking out of place among the country clubs set in their weathered faces and practical suits. The oldest of them, a man who introduced himself simply as Hank, grasped my hand firmly. "You're the spitting image of him, you know," he said without preamble. "Same eyes, same way of standing, like you're ready for the deck to shift beneath your feet." I smiled, touched by the comparison. "Thank you. Did you serve with my grandfather?" 30 years, off and on," he confirmed. "South China Sea, Persian Gulf, Mediterranean, wherever the work took us." He studied me for a moment. "James, the Admiral, he told you some things today." It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. Hank glanced at the others, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Good. Marshall wanted you to know, but he could never find the right time. Too many secrets kept too long become a habit hard to break. I'm still trying to understand it all," I admitted. "You don't need to understand everything," another man said. Cal, he'd introduced himself as. "Just enough to know he was more than he seemed, and that what he did mattered." "I'd like to hear more," I said. "If you can tell me." Hank considered this, then nodded toward the French doors leading to the garden. "Walk with us for a bit?" We slipped outside, away from the press of mourners, and my father's watchful gaze. The garden was peaceful in the gathering twilight, the scent of late summer roses hanging heavy in the air. The three men, Hank, Cal, and a quieter one called Bennett, formed a loose circle around me. "Your grandfather saved my life twice," Hank began without preamble. "Once in 68 off the coast of Vietnam, once in 84 in waters I'm still not supposed to name." He never mentioned it again after either time. That's who he was. Did what needed doing, then moved on. He taught me celestial navigation when the electronics failed during a storm near Singapore. Cal added, "Calmest man I ever met, with 30-foot waves crashing over the bow and sensitive cargo in the hold that absolutely could not get wet." "What kind of cargo?" I asked, though I suspected I wouldn't get a straight answer. Cal smiled slightly. "Let's just say it wasn't the rice listed on the manifest." Bennett, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. "Your grandfather kept a journal, did you know that?" I shook my head, surprised. "No, there wasn't one among his personal effects." Wouldn't be, Bennett replied. He didn't keep it at home. Too many questions if it were found. He stored it at the marina, in the safe behind the barometer in his office. My pulse quickened. Is it still there? Should be, Hank confirmed, unless someone's cleared out his office already. Not yet, I said. The marina manager is keeping everything as is until the estate is settled. A process my father was overseeing with his usual efficiency. You might want to retrieve that journal before others go through his things, Cal suggested carefully. It's not classified exactly, but it contains personal accounts that some agencies might prefer remained private. The implications were clear. If my father found the journal during his methodical cataloging of Grandpa's possessions, it would likely disappear, either confiscated by government entities alerted by his inquiries or deliberately destroyed by my father himself to maintain his version of who Marshall Sullivan had been. I'll go tonight, I decided. After the reception. The three men exchanged glances. We'll accompany you, Hank said, if you don't mind. Pay our respects to the old place one last time. I understood then that they weren't just Grandpa's colleagues. They were his brothers-in-arms, men who had shared experiences beyond ordinary seamanship, who had kept the same secrets for decades. I'd appreciate the company, I told them sincerely. As we turned to re-enter the house, I caught sight of my father watching us through the window, his expression unreadable. I lifted my hand in acknowledgement, and after a moment he nodded once before turning away. The remainder of the reception passed slowly. I made the expected rounds, accepted condolences, answered polite questions about my naval career with equally polite deflections. By the time the last guests began departing, shadows had lengthened across the manicured lawn, and exhaustion pulled at every muscle. My mother found me in the kitchen, supervising the caterers, cleanup. You should get some rest, she said, genuine concern in her eyes. It's been a terrible day for you. Actually, I said, deciding on honesty, I thought I might go down to the marina. Spend some time in Grandpa's office while it's quiet. She looked surprised, but not suspicious. Tonight? Are you sure? It's getting late. I won't stay long, I assured her. I just need to say goodbye to that part of him, too. Understanding softened her expression. Of course. Take your time. Your room will be ready when you get back. I hesitated, then asked the question that had been bothering me since the church. Mom, did you know about Grandpa's other work? She held my gaze for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes. Not details, she said finally, but I grew up with a father who disappeared for months at a time, who sometimes came home with injuries he wouldn't explain, who took calls in the middle of the night and left without saying where he was going. She smiled faintly. I knew there was more to his work than moving cargo from one port to another. Did Dad know? Her smile faded. Your father sees what he wants to see, Morgan? He built a narrative about Marshall, the self-made businessman, the practical entrepreneur, that fit his worldview. Anything that contradicted that narrative? He simply didn't perceive. It was perhaps the most insightful thing I'd ever heard my mother say about my father. And the saddest. I should go, I said softly. The marina office closes at 9. She nodded, then surprised me by pulling me into a brief, fierce hug. You're more like him than you know, she whispered. He would be so proud of the woman you've become. The unexpected gesture and words left me momentarily speechless. By the time I gathered myself to respond, she had already turned back to the caterers, issuing instructions in her quietly efficient way. Hank, Cal, and Bennett were waiting by their car when I emerged from the house, having changed from my dress uniform into civilian clothes. The drive to the marina was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts and memories. Sullivan's Marina sat on a protected cove, a modest operation that had grown over the decades from a simple dock with a fuel pump to a full-service facility, with slips for 50 boats, a chandlery, and a small but respected charter fishing business. The main building housed the office, a basic ship's store, and a repair shop that could handle everything from outboard motors to sophisticated navigation systems. The security guard recognized me immediately. "Miss Morgan," he greeted, genuine warmth in his voice. "Thought you might come by. Sorry about your grandpa." He was a good man. "Thank you, Leo," I replied, touched that he was still using the name he'd called me since childhood. "Just wanted to spend some time in his office. These are friends of his," I added, gesturing to the three men. Leo nodded respectfully to them. "Captain Harris gave me the heads up you might stop by. Take all the time you need. I'll be making rounds but won't disturb you." Captain Harris, the marina manager who had worked alongside Grandpa for the past 15 years. Of course, he'd anticipated this visit. I wondered suddenly how much he knew about Grandpa's other life. The office was exactly as I remembered it. Walls lined with nautical charts, shelves crowded with maritime reference books, and scale models of ships Grandpa had served on, the massive oak desk that had been salvaged from a decommissioned Coast Guard cutter. The familiar sense of salt air, old paper, and the pipe tobacco Grandpa had given up years ago but which had permanently infused the wood paneling wrapped around me like a forgotten embrace. Hank moved immediately to the large barometer mounted on the wall behind the desk. With practiced hands, he released a catch I would never have noticed, and the entire fixture swung outward like a door, revealing a small safe built into the wall. "Do you know the combination?" I asked, suddenly realizing we might have come all this way for nothing. Hank smiled slightly. "I do. Marshall and I set up identical systems in our offices. Backup for each other, in case something happened." His fingers moved surely across the dial. 3 clockwise turns, 2 counter, 1 clockwise again. The safe door opened with a soft click. Inside was surprisingly little. A manila envelope, a small metal box, and a leather-bound journal that looked well used, its corners soft from handling. Hank removed the journal and handed it to me without ceremony. "This should answer most of your questions," he said simply. "The rest, well, some things are better discussed than written, even now." I accepted the journal reverently, feeling the weight of its secrets. "Thank you, all of you, for bringing me here, for trusting me with this." "It's not about trust," Cal said quietly. "It's about legacy. Marshall wanted you to know who he really was, who you come from." Bennett nodded toward the safe. "The box and envelope are for you, too. Personal effects, mostly. Things he wanted you to have but couldn't give you directly without raising questions." I reached in and retrieved them, oddly moved by these tangible connections to a grandfather I was only now beginning to truly know. I don't know what to say. "You don't need to say anything," Hank assured me. "Just remember him, the real him. That's all any of us can ask when we're gone." We stayed for another hour, the 3 old sailors sharing stories of their adventures with Grandpa, the ones they could tell, at least. Mundane tales of port calls and storms weathered, interspersed with carefully worded references to special cargoes and unofficial passengers. Through their words, a fuller picture of Marshall Sullivan emerged, not just the loving grandfather and successful marina owner I'd known, but a man of courage and conviction who had served his country in shadows, asking for no recognition beyond the quiet acknowledgement of those who had served alongside him. As we prepared to leave, I found myself reluctant to return to my parents' house. The thought of sleeping in my childhood bedroom, with its carefully preserved perfection, felt suffocating after the revelations of the day. "There's a hotel near the interstate," I said as we locked up the office. "I think I'll stay there tonight instead of going back." Hank studied me for a moment, understanding in his weathered face. "Running away?" "Strategic retreat," I corrected with a small smile. "I need space to process everything. And to read this," I added, holding up the journal. He nodded, satisfied. "Smart move?" "Your grandfather was a big believer in picking the right ground for difficult confrontations. Never fight on someone else's territory if you can help it." We parted ways in the marina parking lot, exchanging contact information with promises to stay in touch. As their car pulled away, I stood for a moment in the gentle night breeze, the journal clutched to my chest, feeling strangely at peace despite the tumultuous day. My phone buzzed with a text from Jamie. "Where are you? Dad's asking. I hesitated, then replied simply, taking some time to myself. I'll call tomorrow before my flight. Then I got in my rental car and drove toward the hotel, leaving behind the weight of family expectations and stepping into the unknown territory of my grandfather's true legacy, and perhaps my own. The hotel room was generic and soulless, but it offered something my childhood bedroom couldn't: neutral territory. I set Grandpa's journal, the envelope, and the metal box on the bland bedspread, changed into the t-shirt and sweatpants I'd packed for the trip home, and settled against the headboard with a sense of ceremony. For a long moment, I just looked at the leather-bound journal, running my fingers over the worn cover. Opening it felt momentous. A doorway into a past I'd never known existed, a version of my grandfather I'd only glimpsed through the cryptic comments of old sailors and an admiral's carefully worded revelations. Finally, I opened to the first page. The handwriting was unmistakably Grandpa's. Precise capital letters, slightly slanted to the right, economical with space as if paper were rationed. The first entry was dated June 12, 1967. First run completed. Official cargo, agricultural equipment. Actual cargo, radio operators and surveillance equipment. Delivery successful despite Chinese vessel shadowing us through the strait. E worried but maintaining cover story well. Command pleased with execution. The entry was brief, matter of fact, with none of the emotional reflection I might have expected from a personal journal, but that was Grandpa, direct, focused on the task at hand. E would be Eleanor, my grandmother. Command. I could only guess at which agency or military branch that referred to. I continued reading, moving through the years of my grandfather's secret life. Some entries detailed routine shipping runs, genuinely commercial voyages that matched his official career. Others, marked with a small star in the margin, documented the clandestine operations, extracting intelligence assets from hostile territories, delivering specialized equipment to unnamed operatives, transporting sensitive information too risky to transmit electronically. Through it all, a picture emerged of a man who had lived with extraordinary purpose and discipline, who had navigated not just treacherous waters but the complex moral terrain of Cold War operations, maintaining his core values even when the missions tested them. One entry from 1973 struck me particularly. Refused mission today, first time. Command displeased but standing firm. Some lines can't be crossed, even for country. Better men than me have forgotten that, to their eternal regret. E supports decision, though it may cost us financially. He didn't detail what he had refused to do, but the entry revealed a moral compass I recognized, the same quiet integrity that had guided him in his visible life as grandfather, businessman, community member. Hours passed as I read, losing myself in this shadow history that paralleled the life I'd thought I knew. Around 2 a.m., I reached entries from the early 1990s, the period when Admiral Harrington had mentioned working with Grandpa. New officer, assigned as liaison. Harrington, J. Navy background, but understands merchant operations. Smart, observant. Could be problematic or valuable, depending. Will assess over next deployment. A few entries later, H proved his worth during engine failure off Somalia. Quick thinking, steady under pressure. Unusual for a naval officer to understand civilian vessel operations so thoroughly. Beginning to see why command paired us. The relationship evolved through subsequent pages. Initial wariness giving way to professional respect, then genuine friendship. By the Gulf War, they were clearly a well-honed team, handling sensitive operations throughout the Persian Gulf. Then came an entry that made my breath catch. August 3, 1991. Storm caught us west of Singapore. Navigation system failed completely. Flying blind with sensitive cargo and 2 high-value passengers. Storm drove us dangerously close to hostile waters. H nearly washed overboard securing cargo. Pulled him back from literal edge. Navigation by stars alone for 18 hours, until equipment restored. Command calling it exemplary seamanship, H calling it dumb luck and Sullivan's stubbornness. Both partially correct. This had to be the incident the Admiral had referenced, when Grandpa saved his life during a storm. The journal entry, with its characteristic understatement, hardly conveyed the danger they must have faced. The final third of the journal shifted tones subtly. As Grandpa aged, as the world changed around him, his entries became more reflective, occasionally touching on the costs of his double life. He wrote about missed birthdays and anniversaries, about questions from my mother that he couldn't fully answer, about compartmentalizing parts of himself for decades. And then, increasingly, he wrote about me. Morgan showed interest in naval history today. Bright girl, asks questions that cut straight to heart of matters. Reminds me of myself at that age. E says I shouldn't encourage military interests. Wants better for her than constant separation, the weight of secrets. She may be right, but I recognize something in the child. A calling, perhaps. My throat tightened. Reading his observations through the years. My determination in swimming lessons, my fascination with maps and navigation, my stubborn insistence on learning celestial navigation, when other kids my age were focused on video games and pop music. He had seen the path I was on long before I recognized it myself. The entries about my decision to attend Annapolis were particularly moving. Morgan accepted to Naval Academy. Richard furious, as expected. But the girl has salt water in her veins, same as me. Tried to hide my pride when she told me, don't want to drive wedge further between her and her father. But later, alone in the marina office, might have shed a tear or two. Traditions continuing, though she doesn't know the half of it. Perhaps someday. That someday had arrived, though far too late for the conversations I now desperately wished we could have had. The final pages of the journal were sparse, with longer gaps between entries as illness began to claim him. The last entry, dated just 3 weeks before his death, was brief but hit me like a physical blow. Arrangements made with Jay. When the time is right, he'll tell Morgan the truth. Left the ring and the box for her. She's carrying on the work in her own way, though she doesn't know our connection yet. Proud doesn't begin to cover it. She's stronger than I ever was, with a moral compass as true as any I've known. Whatever comes after this life, I'll be watching over that girl, standing by as she navigates her own course. Fair winds and following seas to us both. I closed the journal, tears flowing freely now. Not just grief for the grandfather I'd lost, but for the deeper connection we might have had if secrecy hadn't stood between us. And yet, even through the necessary silence, he had guided me, supported me, recognized in me something kindred that my father never could. Wiping my eyes, I reached for the manila envelope. Inside were photographs I'd never seen before. Grandpa in unfamiliar ports with men I didn't recognize, standing on the bridge of various vessels, shaking hands with official-looking men in contexts that raised more questions than they answered. There was also a folded letter from the Secretary of the Navy, dated 1995, thanking him for, quote, exceptional service to the nation, in carefully vague terms. And most surprisingly, a small medal in a velvet case. Not a military decoration, but something custom, bearing an insignia similar to the one on his ring. No documentation explained it, but the craftsmanship and presentation suggested official recognition of some kind. Finally, I opened the metal box. Inside lay an assortment of items that seemed random at first glance. A tarnished compass, a carved wooden seahorse, a small red book that turned out to be a Russian-English maritime dictionary, a set of coordinates written on weathered paper, and a key with no indication of what it might open. At the bottom of the box was a sealed envelope, with my name written on it in Grandpa's distinctive handwriting. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, half expecting another revelation about covert operations or classified missions. Instead, I found a personal letter, the grandfather I knew speaking directly to me for the first time since his death. My dearest Morgan, if you're reading this, then 2 things have happened. I've shipped out on my final voyage, and James has fulfilled his promise to tell you about the work that filled the shadows of my life. I wish we could have had this conversation face to face, but some habits of secrecy run too deep, and perhaps I was a coward about facing your questions. First, know this. Every story you've heard today is true. The work was real, important, and occasionally terrifying. I'm not at liberty even now to share all of it, but the journal will give you the outline. What matters is that I served something larger than myself, in ways few will ever know. Second, and more important, none of it. Not the secret missions, the classified operations, the quiet recognition from men in positions of power. None of it compares to the pride I've taken in watching you forge your own path. From the moment you first stood on the deck of my boat, feet planted wide against the roll of the waves, eyes scanning the horizon like you were born to it, I recognized a kindred spirit. Your father never understood either of us. He sees the world through spreadsheets and profit margins. Not a wrong perspective, just different from ours. Don't judge him too harshly. He's given you stability and opportunity, even if he couldn't give you understanding. The items in this box aren't valuable in any material sense. The compass guided me through 3 typhoons and a naval blockade. The seahorse was carved by an agent I extracted from Beirut in '82, a small thank you for a passage that saved his life. The coordinates lead to a particular spot in the Pacific that always brought me peace. The key, well, that's for you to discover. You're carrying on the work, Morgan, though in the light rather than shadows. The uniform you wear with such pride is the evolution of the work I did without recognition. Be grateful for that. Secrets take a toll that you'll never have to pay. Remember that true north isn't always where the compass points. Sometimes it's where your heart and conscience lead, when the instruments fail and the stars are hidden. In those moments, trust yourself. You've got better navigation equipment in your soul than any technology they can build. I'll be watching from whatever shore I've landed on. All my love, Grandpa. I read the letter twice more, his voice so clear in my mind I could almost hear him speaking the words. Then I carefully folded it and returned it to its envelope, along with the journal and other items. Some secrets weren't meant to be shared, even now. Some legacies were personal, to be carried rather than displayed. Dawn was breaking as I finally settled into bed, emotional exhaustion pulling me toward sleep. My phone showed multiple missed calls from my father and a single text from Jamie. Whatever you're doing, I hope it helps. Call if you need me. That small offer of support, so different from the Jamie I thought I knew, was the last thing I registered before sleep claimed me. I woke to persistent knocking. Disoriented, I checked the time. Nearly noon. My flight was in 4 hours, and I hadn't even packed properly. The knocking continued. I stumbled to the door expecting housekeeping and found myself face to face with my father. "May I come in?" he asked stiffly. I hesitated, then stepped back, allowing him into the small room. His gaze swept over the unmade bed, my rumpled clothes, the journal and metal box visible on the nightstand. His expression tightened slightly, but he said nothing about the obvious evidence of where I'd spent the night. "Your mother was worried when you didn't come back," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "I texted Jamie," I replied, equally careful. "I needed some time alone." He nodded once. I assumed as much. He paused, then added, "Your flight is at 4. I thought you might need a ride to the airport." The offer surprised me. Was this an olive branch? Or just my father's need to maintain appearances, to ensure the proper farewell was observed? "Thank you," I said. "That would be helpful." He glanced again at the journal on the nightstand. "I see you visited the marina last night." "Yes." I made no effort to hide or explain the journal. This was my territory now, not his. My father's jaw worked for a moment, as if he were physically restraining himself from commenting further. Finally, he said, "I've been doing some research on Admiral Harrington's claims." I waited, not offering either encouragement or resistance. "There appear to be gaps in your grandfather's official record. Periods where his whereabouts and activities aren't clearly documented." He cleared his throat. "And certain connections to government agencies that aren't typical for merchant marine captains." "Yes," I agreed simply. "There are." He met my gaze directly, something unfamiliar in his expression. "Did you know? Before yesterday?" "No," I admitted. "Not specifically. I had impressions. Moments that didn't quite add up, but nothing concrete until the Admiral spoke with me." My father nodded slowly. "I see." He moved to the window, staring out at the unremarkable hotel parking lot. It's difficult to discover you didn't know someone as well as you thought, especially after they're gone. The admission, small as it was, represented a significant shift. Richard Fletcher did not acknowledge limitations in his understanding, especially not to me. I felt the same way. I offered cautiously, but I'm finding that the core of who he was, the parts that really mattered, those were always visible. The rest was just context. My father turned back to face me. Your mother says you're more like him than any of us. I used to think that was her way of explaining why you were so different, so resistant to the path I'd envisioned for you. I tensed, waiting for the familiar criticism to follow. Instead, he surprised me again. I'm beginning to think she was right, he continued. Not just in temperament or interests, but in something more fundamental. A kind of purpose. The word hung between us, unexpected and revealing. My father, who measured success in acquisitions and portfolio growth, was acknowledging a different metric entirely. I didn't understand his choices, my father admitted. The modest marina, when he could have expanded, franchised, built something truly substantial. The time spent with local kids teaching sailing when he could have been networking with investors. It seemed small thinking. It wasn't, I said quietly. He was building something else. Something that couldn't be measured in profit margins. My father's gaze sharpened. Legacy? Community, I corrected. Connection. A life that mattered to the people around him. For a moment I thought he might argue or dismiss the idea. Instead, he nodded slowly. Perhaps. He straightened his already perfect cuffs. In any case, I came to offer a ride to the airport, not to philosophize about different measures of success. The familiar briskness had returned, but something had shifted beneath it. I wasn't sure if the change was in him or in my perception of him, but it felt significant nonetheless. I appreciate the offer, I said. I need about 30 minutes to shower and pack. I'll wait in the lobby, he replied, turning toward the door. He paused with his hand on the knob. Morgan, he said without looking back. I never wanted us to be adversaries. The statement hung in the air between us. Not quite an apology, but perhaps the closest he could manage. I thought of Grandpa's letter, his admonition not to judge my father too harshly. Neither did I said softly. He nodded once, then left, closing the door quietly behind him. The ride to the airport was mostly silent, but not uncomfortably so. My father drove with his usual precision, occasionally commenting on changes to the landscape since my last visit. I responded appropriately, neither seeking deeper connection nor rejecting the small overtures he offered. As we approached the terminal, he finally addressed what had happened at the church. I've spoken with Admiral Harrington, he said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. We've reached an understanding about yesterday's incident. I turned to look at him, surprised. You contacted him directly? I thought it appropriate to address the matter personally. He was gracious. I could only imagine that conversation. My father's carefully constructed apology, the Admiral's military directness. Both proud men, navigating the aftermath of a public confrontation neither had anticipated. What kind of understanding? I asked carefully. My father's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. I acknowledged that my behavior was unacceptable, regardless of provocation or circumstance. He acknowledged that family matters are complex, and grief can lead to regrettable actions. It wasn't exactly reconciliation, but it represented effort on my father's part, an effort I hadn't expected. Thank you, I said simply. He nodded once, accepting the acknowledgement without elaboration. We pulled up to the departures level, and he shifted into park but left the engine running. Your mother wanted me to tell you that Thanksgiving is only a few months away. She hopes you'll request leave. The invitation was delivered stiffly, but it was still an invitation. A small bridge extended across the chasm that had widened yesterday. I'll do my best, I promised, knowing my deployment schedule might make it impossible, but touched by the effort nonetheless. My father nodded, then reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small envelope. Your brother asked me to give you this. Something about continuing a conversation you started. I accepted the envelope, curious about what Jamie might have written that he couldn't simply text me. Safe travels, Lieutenant Commander, my father said formally as I gathered my bag from the back seat. The use of my rank was deliberate, I realized. Not to create distance this time, but to acknowledge who I had become outside the narrow confines of his expectations. It wasn't approval exactly, but it was recognition. Thank you, Dad, I replied, closing the car door gently behind me. He waited until I had entered the terminal before pulling away from the curb, a small courtesy that felt unexpectedly tender from a man who had struck me in anger less than 24 hours earlier. People were complex, I reminded myself. Even Richard Fletcher. Inside the terminal, I found a quiet corner to open Jamie's envelope. Inside was a business card for a therapist specializing in family dynamics and intergenerational trauma, along with a brief note. I've been seeing Dr. Levine for 6 months. It's helping me understand Dad, Mom, and myself better. Thought you might benefit too. This isn't about fixing what happened. It's about finding peace with it. Call if you want to talk more. Jay. I stared at the card, shocked not by the suggestion itself, but by the revelation that my seemingly perfect brother, the one who had appeared to navigate our family's complexities effortlessly, had been struggling enough to seek professional help. Another layer of understanding shifted into place, another perspective realigned. As I boarded my flight back to Norfolk, Grandpa's journal secure in my carry-on, along with the metal box of treasures, I felt a strange sense of completion. Not closure exactly. Too much remained unresolved with my father. Too many questions about Grandpa's secret life remained unanswered, but a sense that important truths had been acknowledged, important connections reestablished. The Admiral was waiting when I landed, standing quietly at the edge of the arrivals area in civilian clothes. I spotted him immediately, his tall figure in military bearing unmistakable even in a crowded terminal. Sir, I greeted him, snapping automatically to attention despite my civilian clothes. At ease, Lieutenant Commander, he said with the ghost of a smile. I'm not here officially. How did you know my flight information? I asked, falling into step beside him as we headed toward the exit. Your brother called my office, he explained. Thought you might appreciate a friendly face after a difficult weekend. Jamie, again, reaching out in ways I wouldn't have expected. That was thoughtful of him. The Admiral nodded. Family is complicated. The good ones try, even when they don't always succeed. We reached his car, and he opened the trunk for my bag. As I placed it inside, he asked, Did you find what you were looking for at the marina? Yes, sir, I confirmed, thinking of the journal, the letter, the small treasures that now connected me more deeply to my grandfather than ever before. Thank you for making that possible. He nodded once, acknowledging without requiring details. Marshall was one of the finest men I ever served with, he said as we settled into the car. Not because he was perfect, he wasn't, but because he understood what mattered. Duty, yes, but also integrity. Compassion, the courage to draw lines when necessary. I'm beginning to understand that better, I said. The Admiral glanced at me. He saw those same qualities in you, you know, long before you put on the uniform. The observation warmed something deep within me, the knowledge that my grandfather had recognized in me not just aptitude or intelligence, but character. The parts of myself I valued most had been seen and affirmed by a man whose opinions suddenly meant more than ever. I'd like to hear more about him sometime, I said. The parts that aren't classified. The Admiral smiled slightly. I think that could be arranged. As we drove through the gathering dusk toward the naval base, I felt Grandpa's ring in my pocket, a solid weight connecting past to present. Tomorrow I would return to duty, to the structured world of naval operations, where my path was clear and my purpose defined. But I carried with me now a deeper understanding of the legacy that had shaped me, the grandfather whose secret service had paralleled my chosen career, the father whose limitations were not the whole of who he was, the brother who was reaching across old divides. The slap that had echoed through a church vestibule had revealed fault lines in my family I'd long pretended didn't exist. But it had also created openings for truth, for recognition, for the possibility, however remote, of healing. Admiral Harrington's intervention had been a catalyst, but the journey afterward had been my own, navigating emotional waters as complex as any maritime chart. As the naval base came into view, its lights glowing against the darkening sky, I thought of Grandpa's final words in his letter. True north isn't always where the compass points. Sometimes it's where your heart and conscience lead, when the instruments fail and the stars are hidden. I would continue to navigate by those stars, visible or not, carrying forward a legacy far richer and more complex than I had ever imagined. And perhaps, in time, I would find ways to bridge the waters that still separated me from my father, guided by the example of a merchant mariner who had sailed far more treacherous seas with courage and grace. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.